We're here to dig into analyzing some formative data and planning some next steps. I want to introduce myself and my wonderful colleague Julia here so that so you know who's talking to you, and then we'll dive into some information. So first off, my name is Brendan Finch. Hello. I taught middle and high school science in Los Angeles for both LAUSD and a couple different charter networks in the LA area. I left the classroom in 2014 to build rocketlit.com, which is our adaptive reading website, and to work on InterOrbit over the last 5 years. I wrote a lot of the assessments on the site initially, and I have been moving away from writing assessments, and now I do a lot of work with different thought leaders at the district, state, and for other curriculum developers to figure out how we can better support students and admin and teachers. And so for this webinar in particular, we have a case study of an amazing teacher leader who we're gonna, hear a lot about how he and his team are using InterOrbit. And we're really, really excited to build more capacity. And then I just want to remind people that I think that pepperoni, jalapeno, and pineapple pizza is the best. It's an adventure. And if you haven't tried that yet, you should get into it. And I'm really excited to introduce my colleague, Julia.
Hi, so I am Julia, and I was an EFL teacher in the Dominican Republic. I've been building materials to support teachers in districts with NGSS implementation for the last 2.5 years with InterOrbit, and I am now InterOrbit's district engagement manager. I also think corn pizza is the best pizza. Sorry, Brendan. Agree to disagree. I know it's kind of odd, and we have odd pizza likings, but it is what it is.
I've never tried corn pizza, and so I can't knock this, but
it's a Caribbean thing. But yes,
okay. I just want more spice. Maybe if there's jalapeno and corn, I can get into it. All right. Anyways, y'all, thank you so much, Julia, for introducing yourself. And welcome everyone to our webinar on analyzing formative assessment data. So our objective for today is to explore how very specifically Oklahoma City Public Schools leverages InterOrbit to build CFAs and then make data-informed decisions from formative assessments. We're going to be here for about an hour. And our agenda is chock full of lots of juicy stuff. First, we're going to talk about what InterOrbit is to set the stage for how this is then implemented in this context. So we have all these phenomena and all these questions and all these assessments, and we also do a lot of professional learning with our partners. So we're excited that y'all are here, and we're excited to dive into that. So we're going to look at these common formative assessments through the lens of Oklahoma City. We'll give some background, and Dan will actually give a little bit of background on what they're thinking. We'll look at their strategy on how they built these assessments and design was like and what the content of the assessments is. And then we'll dive into some data analysis. So we'll look at what these assessments look like. So Dan used these version A and version B assessments for his common formatives, and much to one of the suggestions in the chat earlier to form, kind of like tiered groups. So think about this through the context of MTSS, or like what I need to reteach over time. And that's kind of the one of the lenses that was used for this. We'll do a little data walkthrough, and we'll run through a data chat protocol. We would love to have everyone participating in the chat. We'll give some opportunities for that as well. And then we want to figure out what we can do next. So once you're looking at formative data, and because three-dimensional data is so complex, we want to just offer some suggestions. Some of these come directly from Dan and some are from us. So we'll talk about how you can refamiliarize yourself with standards and assessment goals, talk about how you might be able to reteach and reassess with a novel phenomena or a lesson, and then also look at some answer choice and distractor analysis, which this is a main focus of Dan's and Oklahoma City Public Schools' work. And so we'll look at how they go through that. And on that note, let's do this. So we're going to start out just by defining what InterOrbit is and explaining that. And then after that, we can dive into all of our data. So if you don't know what InterOrbit is, so we are a website and we have all of these phenomena. And our goal is to give students opportunities to take what they're learning in your classroom and apply it to something specific in the real world. And that process of taking things that we learn and applying them to make sense of things that are happening in the real world is called sense making. And so to do this and to think about this, we're going to take we're going to look at an actual standard, a performance expectation. So NGSS 1.2, and think about how we can leverage both the SEP of developing some models, those different DCIs, and those cross-cutting concepts. Everything we do is anchored so deeply in the standard because we want to gather data on whether students are struggling with their knowledge, their application of an SEP, or of a cross-cutting concept. And so with each of those standards, we write all of these questions, and those questions are tagged with very, very discrete parts of the standard. And the way that we think about this is, and this is kind of off canon from the NGSS, what we found a lot of success in our partners is by scaffolding up to what that sense-making goal is. Because that sense-making goal is, I mean, it's a rigorous thing that students have to do, take their learning and apply it to something new. And it's something that adults struggle with as well. And so one of the ways that we do that is we write these questions that focus on leveraging the dimensions. And what I mean by that is we'll have some questions that focus on just the DCIs, and those come in the form of their prior knowledge. So DCIs from middle school going back to elementary school, or from high school going back to middle school, and seeing if students have readiness for the on-grade level content. And then in addition, core content questions, which will be DCI only questions that are on grade level. So if we're looking at that middle school standard, these will be middle school questions for core content. And then we use two-dimensional questions to kind of scaffold up a little bit further. So we'll ask questions about the cross-cutting concepts and the DCI, or about the SEP and the DCI. And that's how we kind of dissociate and pull apart that standard to see how we can scaffold students up, or maybe find areas of strength or where students need some support. And then we'll ask three-dimensional questions. We call those sense-making 3D questions. Some of them will be multiple choice. We also have questions that are free response, where students are constructing a response. They're building a model to show how, their concepts that they've learned and the skills of the SEP can be applied through the lens of this specific phenomena. And we take all those questions also. So if you want to go and you want to build your own questions, you can. We've also built these 3 different pre-made assessment types that you can use. And one of these is in the exact format that Dan and the OKCPS team are using within their district. So a scaffolded formative involves assessing a single standard, so one performance expectation. They're 4 to 5 questions long, and those typically have one-dimensional questions and then scaffolding up to 2-dimensional questions, and that can have the DCI and SEP or the cross-cutting concept, and then a 3-dimensional question later on. So in this way, we're able to ask questions that kind of scaffold up and see if students are struggling with an SEP or a DCI or all 3 of them together. And then we have things that we call sense-making summatives, which are best served at the end of a course of study around a single standard. They're about 4 questions long, and they'll involve 2-dimensional questions, and that will hit those same DCI, SEP, and cross-cutting concepts, or a 3-dimensional question. So think about that scaffolded formative as hitting the DCI and 2-dimensional and 3-dimensional. Maybe students are struggling with their knowledge and they're going to struggle with the whole thing. Sense-making summative is assuming that students do have that knowledge that they need of the DCI, and it's looking at application of that knowledge. And then finally, we also have these inventories. So we talked about these a little bit in our last webinar around pre-assessment. These will cover all standards in a grade level. They are doozies. So 25 to 40 questions. They're going to involve just rigorous questions that are 2 or 3-dimensional, integrating the DCIs, the SCPs, and the cross-cutting concept. These are great for like a thorough baseline or like an end of the year snapshot before students take a standardized test or something like that. All of these different opportunities or all of these different assessments will provide different phenomena for students to look at. Scaffolded formative and the summative, we'll have one of those for each standard. We'll have 2 different phenomena because we want students to apply their learning to 2 different phenomena. The inventory will have a ton of like 14 different phenomena. So the number of phenomena is the number of standards in that grade level subject area. So for chemistry, we'll have every single performance expectation will have a different phenomena. So those are the 3 different types of pre-assessments that we have on Inner Orbit. And with those things, you can use those questions and give those to students and generate really, really detailed data. And what we're looking to do is just say, okay, so students struggled with, developing these models at the 6-8 level. Well, more specifically, they need support in developing a model to describe unobservable mechanisms, that really discrete and specific part of that standard. And if we know that that's what students are struggling with, then we can build scaffolds for that really, really discrete thing. And if we know where they have strengths, then we can lean into that too. Awesome. The last thing that we do are we provide a lot of professional learning. So in this session right here, we are looking to deliver some best practices and some pedagogy that we've found to be effective and other partners have. We do a lot of research as well. We're looking to model engaging classroom strategies with our PD, or professional learning, our PL. And we take in a lot of teacher feedback. So we really, really love working with districts and teachers. So if you'd like us to come in, either physically in person or to dive in through like a virtual session, then we would love to meet up with your teachers and deliver some PD around how the NGSS come to life in these assessments. And that's these really specific concrete things that are really, really powerful. And so if you want to meet with us or sign up for a pilot on your own, thank you so much, Julia. Julia dropped a couple of links to our calendar and to a website where you can sign up for a free pilot. So if you want to check that out, then please do that. And otherwise, let's dive into our story time. So I'm going to go ahead and pass it off to Julia to introduce our story, and then we'll have Dan talk a little bit more about their context and kind of their philosophy as they approached these, like this gargantuan task of building a formative assessment system. To you, Julia.
Thank you, Brendan. Now, to formally kick off the content of our webinar, let's take a look at how Oklahoma City leverages formative assessments to gather actionable data. So for some context, Oklahoma City Public Schools is the largest school-suited district in Oklahoma. They needed to be able to predict students' outcome for standardized tests. However, their strategy and assessment system in place did not provide enough data and tools to do this. The questions in these assessments were mostly content-specific, focusing only on the DCI. So the questions were not aligned to the performance expectations or the standards. And with this being the only instance where students were assessed, the teachers did not have the resources to provide students with opportunities to transfer knowledge into real-life scenarios. So they had to do something. Let's hear from the secondary science curriculum himself, Dan Covey, on the outlook of this story and what were the contingencies put in place to address these situations. Over to you, Dan.
Originally, when I came in, our current assessment system was not able to predict student outcomes. So it was like, why? As we got digging in, we're like, we're spending a lot of time really teaching and assessing just like this small little piece of content. And we weren't actually like ever asking students or even teaching them to be able to go one step further than that and transfer the knowledge and use it on a 3-dimensional scale. And so it was like you were asking questions like, what is the basic unit of life? Or if I look under a microscope at all living things, what am I going to see? And it's like kids could answer those questions. But then when you said, I picked up a pine cone in the park and I took it home and like, I want to figure out, is it living or not? How do I approach this? Like, I don't know. And it's the same question. It's just now they're having to transfer that knowledge. And so as we got digging in, we were like, okay, how do we approach this? And we're like, okay, let's back up. Let's backwards design the whole thing from where we want the end game to be. So that meant backing up and looking at what are the biology standards, what are the physical science standards that we want students to be able to master by the time they leave our schools. And so we talked about that a lot using the guaranteed and viable like standard type system. Like, what can we guarantee for our students when they come to our high schools that this is what this is what they're going to leave knowing and being able to do. And so it's looking at what stories do we want the students to be able to tell through those standards, and doing the process of figuring out, okay, what do those look like in the bundles, and bundling those standards, and then going, okay, out of those like big groups of standards, what standards kind of play the end game for those groups of bundles? So some of them, it's like, well, if they're going to get to that, they're going to have to teach these other 2 standards anyways. So if we're trying to narrow down what we're actually focusing on, let's identify the standards. And a lot of people will call them essential standards. For us, we use the word priority standards because it's like we want to set this idea, you're teaching all the standards, like we're still hitting them, but these are the ones we want you to pull up and focus your PLC time around with your other teachers and go in deep on what we want to like do. And so it's like, okay, so if we're going to do that, what do we have to have in place for that? Well, first, we wanted to make sure that if that was our end game, we had to go back and look at middle school and go, what middle school standards are going to lead to those end game standards? And then what elementary standards are going to lead to those middle school standards that are going to lead, and so we were designing it through a holistic curriculum lens so that we could get to the end goal. Then it's like, okay, if you're going to build that and try to like figure out if the changes we're making are actually moving people in that direction, we have to have a way of tracking if students are meeting those goals or not. And again, we already knew one of our problems of practice was that we were not creating assessments that were able to accurately like measure that.
So Dan talked about backwards design and planning. Let's recap on the steps that he mentioned to achieve this. So first of all, we have to determine the end goal. And for this, we need to ask and define what are those standards that we need students to be able to master by the time they leave the school, or as Dan calls it, the end game. Then we'll move on to standard bundling, where they figure out a structure where standards are bundled together to narrow down the steps to achieve this end game. After that, we identify the priority standards to focus on PLCs by understanding little bit more in depth the progression of these standards by determining next steps too. And finally, we create assessments. And developing different versions of CFAs with different phenomena and questions is definitely crucial to give students multiple opportunities to transfer their knowledge to different scenarios, as they would have to do it on a standardized test. So now, Brendan will cover a little bit more about how these assessments are created and designed. Over to you, Brendan.
Thank you so much, Julia. And thank you, Dan, for talking a little bit more about how you thought about your assessments. Thank you all also for being patient as we try to figure the sound out. That was fun. So we're going to dive into one of the assessments that OKCPS built around a high school biology standard, which is HSLS13. And in this standard, students need to plan and conduct an investigation to provide evidence that feedback mechanisms maintain homeostasis. So the SCP within this performance expectation is planning and carrying out investigations. It's pretty apparent in the performance expectation. The DCI involves structure and function. Mainly, there are these feedback mechanisms that help to maintain homeostasis. Some are positive and some are negative feedback mechanisms. And that there's stability and change, and that feedback can either stabilize or destabilize the system. So the important part here is kind of like that jargon of like understanding stabilization versus destabilization. So in the formative assessments that OKCPS built, they used our sort of like formative assessment guidelines, which involve content-only questions, and there were usually 2 of those. Some of the content and cross-cutting concepts questions, and some with content and SCPs, and then finally 3-dimensional questions later on as that full scaffold and ramp up to that rigorous performance at the end. They built 2 different versions of these assessments. So there's version A, and in this case, we have a phenomenon around how do sweat glands help us thermoregulate, and then a version B, which is why do we shiver when we're cold? And in this way, teachers were able to give assessment A after initial instruction to see how students did, and if there was reteaching needed, they could do that and then apply version B. Or if you're using an MTSS model, as we heard some folks in the chat talk about, you could use the version B as your after that reteaching with that tier 2 group of kiddos to see like what kind of progress was made and if we could move the needle for folks that needed more help. Okay, great. So the phenomena here in that second assessment is why do we shiver when we're cold? And in this case, what we're looking at is, like thermoregulation, and we give students stages of hypothermia. We talk a little bit about these feedback mechanisms, so positive and negative feedback mechanisms, how the body responds when it gets too warm or too cold. And this is the context that we're giving students, again, for them to be able to understand, what's happening when when somebody is approaching hypothermia, which hopefully y'all have never gone into. So in this assessment, we're going to go through those different question types now to see how we scaffold up. So that first question we call core content questions, and these just focus on the DCI. So at the very, very beginning of the scaffold, we're asking questions about what students know. And so they need to understand that shivering maintains homeostasis so that an organism can remain alive. And this is for people specifically. It's just asking about homeostasis and understanding, what that structure is and how shivering relates to that. And in this way, we're only asking students about what they know. We're not asking them about SCPs. There's no planning code investigations. There's no cross-cutting concepts involved here. It's just things that they know about the standard. And then we'll walk up a step in our scaffold to our 2-dimensional questions. And so these will ask students about their application of the cross-cutting concept, stability, and change in addition to that DCI. So this question says, which scenario represents a body in a stable state because feedback systems are maintaining homeostasis. We want stability and change. So is this something that's stabilizing or that's being destabilized? And so in this, we're deliberately leaving out the science and engineering practice and just focus on that cross-cutting concept and that DCI. So we can sort of dissociate parts of the standard and say they're struggling with stability and change, or they're struggling with that planning and kind of carrying out investigations. And then finally, we can go a step further. We don't think that the practices or the cross-cutting concepts, one is not above the other in this scaffold. We're going to say that those 2 are equal, but different. And in this case, we're going to ask questions about, in the data table shown here, there's evidence that, and we want students to be able to pull evidence from this data table to describe, like when you can't maintain homeostasis any longer. And that's one of the pieces of planning code investigations, is pulling information from these data tables. And so they're using their understanding of structure and function and of maintaining homeostasis, and also that SEP of planning code investigations, in order to answer this question. And then we can scaffold up to the very, very end, where we ask 3-dimensional questions, where we want students to draw conclusions from the results of that data table. And so they take their understanding of the SEP, of the DCI, and the cross-cutting concept, and these all come together in these complex different answers. So they need to have a nuanced understanding of stability and change, of homeostasis, and also how stability and how they can pull data from this and understand how, this investigation might be planned and how bodies might react to different parts of this. So conclusions from data, which is a part of planning care investigations. Awesome. Yep. And so as we're pulling this together, this is actually the exact assessment that was given across these different students. And now we're going to dive into kind of like what the data chat might look like if you're looking at this data across a district. And so these were the assessments that were given, or this is version B of that assessment. And now let's dive into a data chat to kind of see how, they collaborate within Oklahoma City Public Schools. And then we can dive into the data a little bit in a more anonymized way and see what happened as they look through that. So I'm going to let Dan take it away one more time and talk a little bit more about his story and how he fosters collaboration. And I'm going to drag one of these videos in here because it's more reliable than YouTube.
Everywhere. And so a lot of this is about developing a protocol that explicitly spells out step-by-step instructions. So like for me, we have a protocol for analyzing the CFAs. Select this report, go to this menu, click on gradebook, and walk them through until they get to the point where they're just pulling that data out. We have a list of questions that basically walk them through analyzing the data like that. They would do that before they even came into PLC. Looking at the item analysis, that's the bread and butter and limited amount of time of PLC. And we walk them through this in the protocol, like what are the patterns of things that they're answering incorrectly? What is the highest correct answer or the highest incorrect? As you're going through the 5 questions, do you see patterns in the things that students are consistently answering incorrectly? So that when they come into the collaborative time, it's really about, is there a pattern in the complexity of the questions that students could answer versus ones they couldn't? What misconceptions may have prevented the mastery? What will you reteach within the next 24 to 48 hours? Because this isn't about 3 weeks later, I'm now intervening. It literally has to be closer to that assessment time. So this CFA assessment turnaround process has to be quick. And we're constantly talking to them about not to do this in isolation, because you're the one who designed the best first instruction the first time. And so we're going to assume that you provided the best that you had. And so if you're using the same brain to come up with a reteach, you're probably going to struggle to come up with something novel that's going to hit the kids in an entirely different way. And so you want to go in and bang your head around with other professionals who might have other ideas. Our job is too big oftentimes for one brain to do with any kind of speed. Not only do the CFAs provide data to the teacher about what the students don't know, but we, as part of our process, encourage our teachers to go in and take the CFAs themselves to begin thinking about how they're approaching the standard before they go in and teach. And I had this moment that was I was in a PLC with this he's a brand new teacher. He was so the first couple CFAs, I didn't take them. I didn't look at them or anything. And he's like, why is it going so wrong? And then he's and then I pulled up the CFA and he was oh, he's and now I've taken every CFA afterwards, and it allows me to better adjust my instruction because I know I better understand the end game. And I was boom, that is exactly what we had a conversation about. Leveraging these CFAs to help teachers better understand what the end game of a standard is.
I thought that was one of the most powerful parts of my conversation with Dan, was understanding the end game of a standard and being able to apply that understanding in your instruction and respond to it. So I love that. And so we'll move on from there. And if y'all have any questions or comments, please feel free to reach out in the chat and let us know if there's anything we can do to be helpful or clarify around this. So what Dan described is very similar to the data chat protocol, and I'll kind of like give some context for this as well. What we're looking to do is give teachers an opportunity to sit together and not only understand the assessment, but understand what to do next. And so we think about this through the lens of observation. And so what do you see? What are the highest scores? What are the lowest scores? And then doing some analysis. And so looking at whether or not, there are connections between ideas. So maybe they struggle with this because of that. And so not solving problems yet, but making connections. Then finally, to do some implications. So as Dan talks about, what are you going to do in the next 24 to 48 hours in order to, address this thing that you see in your data? And then we add in the stage of reflection because we want teachers to reflect on the process of assessment. What changes will you make to your assessment next time? Maybe even what conversations do you want to have next time with your groups of teachers in your PLC, or maybe with administration at the district level. Okay, cool. So now let's dive into the two different versions of assessment that they administered. And we've kind of anonymized this data and we've just added colors instead of percentages to make it a little bit more clear about what's changing over time. And so the first data set, this is our version A assessment. This is the first one. This is around sweat glands and thermoregulation. So the version A was given to 616 students. So a bunch of kiddos took this assessment across many, many different biology classrooms. And on this, I'm gonna give you a minute to look through it so that we're just three parts of the NGSS that were covered. So that DCI of structure and function, the SEP of planning, care, and investigations, and finally that cross-cutting concept of feedback mechanisms and stability and change. And so I'm going to give you a minute to go ahead and look through this and take some time. And Julia just dropped in a link into the chat. If you want to see this data in like a more expanded and easier to see view, you can click on that Google Drive link to see what this looks like. But just take a minute and observe this. And if you have any observations, hold them because we're going to have some time for data chat in just a minute. So take a minute, look through this data. All right, so hopefully you've got some thoughts around what you see in this data, what observations you may make. And so we'll take some of those observations in a minute. But I want to show you what the version B looked like. So again, they gave version A, and then teachers, did something. There was some other instruction after they kind of like knocked their heads around in a group, collaboratively to figure out what they would do differently. And in the version B assessment, we noticed a 6 percentage point increase in their DCI scores, which is great. Planning, care, and investigations went up by 18 points within the version A to version B, which is significant. And again, these are two separate phenomena. So students are taking their understanding of one phenomena and trying, answering these questions, and then doing the same thing with a different phenomena. The cross-cutting concept of stability and change saw an 8 percentage point increase as well. And so take some time right now. We don't have to go over this in great detail, but just looking at, so the same different parts of the standards were addressed, and there was that 18 percentage point growth between version A and version B in the SEP, 6 points in the DCI, 8 points on the cross-cutting concept. So tremendous growth in the SEP. So kudos to all of those teachers and students for growing. And I wonder what went on with the DCI. So if it's okay, we'll dive into a data chat protocol. We're going to use this data right here, but we're actually going to use it through the lens of our assignment report. And so this is a question level analysis report where we look at how students performed on each question. So probably what you're wondering when you look at this data is, all right, so I can see clearly that students did better on the SEP than they did on the cross-cutting concept or the DCI, but like why? And what does that even mean? And so what we're going to do is we're going to dive into that data by question to see what parts of what standards in what questions students struggled with, and maybe we can get a little bit more information. So this is the report that Dan and his team, and we strongly recommend PLCs dive into because it really helps us to look at the 3 dimensions in each question. And so I'll show you what screenshots of this look like on inner orbit, but we've kind of simplified it here. And to frame our conversation, I want to remind everyone. So step 1 is going to be observation. So in the chat, I'd love you to make observations as you look at this data, and I'll explain the data a little bit more in just a second. But some examples of observations are, what did you see? Students excelled with this, students struggled with that. And I want you to think about this through the lens of observing without judgment or interpretation. We're just stating facts here. And so Dan would say, what are the highest scores? What are the lowest scores? What questions the students the best with? What do they struggle with? And that way we can have a more productive conversation after that. And this, in his context, he gave us pre-work. So before they even sit down with their PLC, they look at this and make their observations. So again, when they sit down collaboratively, they can have conversations about what to do about it, or an analysis conversation, instead of just using that time to look at scores, which may not be as productive. Okay, so what we have here are the different questions that were asked in this assessment. And what I see is that students struggled, or they did. A green dot means students did well. A yellow dot means that they did okay. And a red dot means that students struggled a lot with this. So Julia, what are some things that you observe when you're looking at these different questions and this data?
So I see that students excelled with questions that involved the DCI. So that may mean that they are familiar with the content of structure and function. What do you see, Brendan?
So it looks like the students did really well. It's interesting to me that they did so well on the sense-making questions. That is really, really interesting. And they struggled more with the stability and change questions, both of them, which is really interesting to me.
I also see they excelled with the science and engineering practices, since we saw significant improvement from one version to the other. So that means there was a big improvement in planning and carrying out investigations too.
Super interesting. Great. I know that the observations here aren't like a super compelling thing to write about in the chat, but if you want to take some time in the chat, I'd love for you to make some observations in the chat, or we can dive into the second part. Yeah, and to answer the question that was asked. So this is version B of the assessment. So after the initial assessment and the reteaching, how did they do on version B? Okay, so let's dive into step 2, which I think this is a little bit more fun in terms of, what we're looking at. So let's do some analysis. So in the chat, if you want to write down some analysis and ways for you to frame your sentences, would be, the data. What does the data suggest? Or as Dan said, what are some patterns in this data? So you can say students struggle with X because of Y, or students understand A because of B. This is asking, so make sense of what the data says and why. Don't solve problems at this point. We just want to say, I think that these two things are connected, but this isn't what I'm going to do about it. So share your thoughts in the chat. What are some things that you see, some connections in this data? And Julia, do you have any initial analysis to share?
Well, I think across some other districts that we've seen data too, we've seen the common struggle with the SEP. So students may have struggled with the SEP because sometimes it is not explicitly taught. Teachers might focus a lot on the SEPs and on the cross-cutting concepts. That's what I was referring to. So students may have struggled with the cross-cutting concepts because they're not explicitly taught. Teachers might focus on the content more, or on the science and engineering practices, and those are the two big focuses. And sometimes the cross-cutting concepts are like in the back burner. What do you think, Brendan?
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, so it's clear to me that they did well on the sense-making question because they also did well on the two-dimensional question. And so to your point, that may be because students understand how to draw conclusions from, like the results of an investigation or experiment or a data table that we give them. So that's why they did well on the 3-dimensional and the 2-dimensional content and practices questions. So we'll give you a minute. Go ahead and write down any suggestions from the data in the chat. We'd love to hear your thoughts around this. And then we get to the fun part after this, which is the problem solving. So what else does this data suggest? What patterns do you see in this data? So there's a question in the chat. I think it was just sent to hosts and panelists, and I want to clarify it and share it out with everyone because this is a good question. So how did teachers reflect on this data at this level without lots of training first? And so thank you for that question. So if you want everyone to see your questions, just make sure that the little blue button next to your chat says everyone. So I know that Oklahoma City Public Schools, they have instructional coaches at each school site. And so the science director was able to train those instructional coaches at each of the school sites, and they are present for these PLC meetings. And so they made sure that the teachers ahead of time made observations, and they sat down later on, together as a PLC, and they went through the analysis and those implications, that problem solving part. And so there was somebody there to guide them with that. And there's a data chat protocol, a series of 5 questions that that Dan mentioned. And those are things that teachers are primed with. So there are resources that were created to help scaffold that process. I think if you just had teachers sit down and look at the data without much scaffolding, it's difficult to know what to do with this because the data is really complex and these questions are really complex as well. And so the idea here was to give teachers very, very specific steps to go through so that you could walk through the data and walk through each of these questions and answer them one by one, and then have somebody there to kind of like facilitate the process as well. So if we got stuck on something, we could move forward productively and continue on. So I see a lot of observations in the chat from people saying that students may have relied on the SEP a lot more, and that, you know, those cross-cutting concepts may maybe just take a long time to teach. It's really interesting. We'll dive into one of the questions in a minute to see what that cross-cutting concept question looked like, very specifically in the answer choices, which provides a little bit more context for why students may have done why they may have struggled a little bit more with those. But I see a lot of thoughts in the chat about people saying that the cross-cutting concepts are not explicitly integrated in instruction. And I think even in assessment and instruction, there's not a lot of support that is typically provided because folks focus on those SEPs. And so we're fans of the cross-cutting concepts, but I think a lot of the assessment design that we see at the state level focuses a lot on the SEPs as well. So those things can, you know, I'm sure they will be folded in the future as we have other iterations of our assessments, but that's an observation and that resonates deeply with me and Julia as well, as Julia shared earlier. So let's dive into some implications here, which is really interesting. So what are the implications of this data for teaching and assessment? And in Dan's context, which I love this so much, he said, in the next 24 to 48 hours, what am I going to do? How can I extend students' learning or support their growth by doing this thing? And it's an immediate thing. And that's why I would give exit slips in my own class, because I want to know what I would do tomorrow to adjust for what students either totally got or struggled with today. And so let's consider some specific action items. So if this was you or in your own classroom, or if you are supporting a group of teachers that got data like this, what would you do? And, you know, when would you do it? Julia, to get things started, what would you do if this was your data?
Yes. So considering students struggled the most with the cross-cutting concepts, in the next 24 to 48 hours, we could extend student learning by amplifying the concept of stability and change to make it a little bit more explicit for students. We could use sentence stems or a set of prompts that isolate the cross-cutting concept and foster those connections and that building of ideas around stability and change. What would you do, Brendan?
No, I like that. So that those sentence stems are a great idea. I think it's really, really hard to think about that. There's probably some language so that there's stabilization and destabilization, and I'm kind of foreshadowing some future slides. But there are a couple of things for this specific cross-cutting concept that I want to dive into, and it may just be a language or jargon issue. And so diving into those things to see what that looks like. But I also think you can use a lot of very casual, you know, like checks for understanding, like just asking verbal questions to students, or when you're walking around between groups and they're working on something, say, hey, is that stabilizing or destabilizing that system? Is this positive feedback or negative feedback? Those are examples of things I think you can just integrate very simply as you walk around. So I think the cross-cutting concepts lend themselves well, and STEM Teaching Tools has a resource with just a bunch of sentence stems. So as Julia mentioned, that you can easily just kind of drop into instruction. So we have a link to that, and we'll share it with y'all either in the description of this video or as we share out the recording. So if you're looking for ways to integrate cross-cutting concepts into instruction in a more informal way, or into your checks for understanding, that's a great way to be able to do that. Thank you, Julia. So Julia just dropped it into the chat. So if you're here with us right now, you've got that resource. So if you're looking for ways to kind of like, ask more questions about stability and change, or scale proportion quantity, or patterns, then that cross-cutting concept resource is excellent. STEM Teaching Tools does great work. Cool. Now we can dive into a little bit of the reflection piece of our data chat protocol. And so in this, we want to ask questions like, what questions about teaching and assessment did looking at the data raise for you? Did questions of equity arise? How so? And if not, why not? And then finally, is there any additional analysis you'd like to complete? And why would you like to do that? Finally, what do you want to try in your classroom as a result of this data? So an example would be, maybe I'm going to use more question stems and maybe like print out the cross-cutting concepts and identify one of them that I'm going to explicitly ask questions about each day or each week or something like that. Be using a do now every day that focuses around stability and change, and see if we can give students more opportunities to answer some simple questions around that cross-cutting concept. In addition, I do think the questions of equity should always be looked at every time we look at assessments and data to figure out, like, was this equitable, or are there other things that we can do better next time? Awesome. Thank you all very, very much. I really appreciate that. Let's dive into the last portion of our session, which is what could we do next? And so as we're diving into this data, I want to think about, maybe what we could do differently when we are looking at this content. So if those were the results of our assessment, what do we do next? And so first off, I'm going to walk through definitely refamiliarizing yourself with the standard and the assessment are simple things to do next. And so as Dan said, he has teachers dive into the performance expectation and the assessment boundary. So figure out, like, where exactly does this end, and what are we looking for students to be able to do? So in this case, assessment does not include the cellular processes involved in the feedback mechanisms. We're looking at macro, kind of like big processes here. We don't need to get into the nitty gritty of the standard. And so if you dive into the assessment boundary, I think sometimes, like, I want to explain everything about something, but I really just need to stop and just explain, this one piece, just the macro parts of how all these pieces come together. And then I think having teachers take the assessment themselves is super, super helpful. Obviously, if you don't understand what that goal is, you won't understand what students need to do. And if you do understand, like, what they need to piece together in order to answer these questions, then you can build your instruction to help with that. Obviously, this toes the line of, we don't want to teach to the test, but understanding what that process looks like, I think from like a mental frame standpoint is really, really helpful, because, that we can help students to like scaffold up to that. And I can adjust my instruction to say, I need to clarify and explicitly ask questions about this cross-cutting concept. That's a big thing in this data, which is the cross-cutting concept. And now I'm going to pass to Julia to walk us through our option number 2, which is about reteaching and reassessing with a novel phenomena.
Thank you, Brendan. So this is another option. By diving into the examples of phenomena and sense-making in instruction and assessment, we can definitely set students up for success with authentic sense-making experiences that are deeply tied to the standards. And we also promote their ability to apply their learning to novel phenomena. So let's see about 3 different phenomena that are on the Inner Orbit website that teachers could use to give additional opportunities for students to make sense of feedback mechanisms. So for example, in the beginning of the unit, we could have a low stakes whole class walkthrough and discussion about how one cherry can ripen the whole tree. Then mid-unit, we could have a printed scaffolded group phenomena exploration, and students may look at how our body responds to high blood sugar. And finally, we could administer individual online assessments at the end of the unit, in this case, looking at how do salmon osmoregulate. Back to you, Brendan.
Thank you, Julia. And all of these those are all examples in addition to the assessment phenomena that OKCPS used on Inner Orbit. So there are 5 different phenomena for the standard. For some of our standards, to be candid, we have less phenomena, and some of them we have more. But the goal would be to use these phenomena as noticings and wonderings, and to be able to scaffold students up and ask those tough questions to kiddos before you give them that final assessment at the end of instruction. So you can ask a couple questions earlier on, in addition to that, like the formative and summative, or the 2 summative version A and B assessments later on. So the last thing that we recommend that you could do, and especially with this data that we're looking at here, is to dive into our question level analysis in our assignment report. So if you give this assessment on Inner Orbit, you're going to get this report data that looks like this, and I'll show you in just a second. And really what you can do here is look at the wording of particular questions to find concepts that need additional clarification, or you can identify groups that need additional instruction around a core concept, or identify groups for elaboration activities. So if you have a group of kiddos and you're like, wow, like you get it, we don't need to linger too long here, then we can apply them or give them some opportunities for elaboration, maybe give them another example of a phenomena and say, like, okay, cool, you got that. Now, like, tell me how it applies here. And so that might be a nice way to sort of like pass this on. So for this assessment, we gave an assessment. This is actual data from the assessment, where we look at, the number of students that answered questions right. So I'm going to explain what this report looks like a little bit, so you have a little bit more context. So first off, on the left-hand side here, it shows what dimensions of the standard were assessed. So this is looking at a 2-dimensional question hitting stability and change, and the DCI of structure and function. And in addition to that, we see the number of, or the types of assessments, the types of questions that we have in here. So let me use this little squiggly thing. And so it looks like, so the majority of students answered this question correctly. And so specifically, there were 37%, but I also see that there are a lot of students that answered, so the number one distractor and a second distractor correctly as well. So that's kind of interesting. So if I dive into this a little bit more to try to figure out kind of like where students are at, I'm going to look at it and I'm going to say, okay, so I see that there was a significant number of students that answered all of these represent a body in a stable state. So I just want to call out that in terms of taking assessments, I think when students see all of the above or all of these are examples or none of these are examples, that a higher proportion of students will answer that rather than reading all of the answer choices very, very specifically. So strongly recommend that if you find something like this in the answer choices or in the results of an assessment, that we dive in and say, okay, so we need to tell students, hey, just because it says all of these or none of these doesn't mean that that's necessarily the right answer. You need to read each answer choice very specifically. And this may have been the reason why, students struggle with this question, is that they just automatically chose all of these. So if we look at that second question, now we can dive into this in a little bit greater detail. And so this is the second stability and change cross-cutting concept question. So we asked students about stability and change and structure and function. This is all still tied to HSLS 1.3. And we see that the majority of students answered this question correctly, but there were a significant number of students that struggled with this question out of the 553 that attempted it. And so what I saw here when we dove into this data is I noticed that the terms stabilize and destabilize are present in every single answer choice. So I'm wondering maybe if students are struggling with the understanding of stabilization versus destabilization. And while that may be the case for some of our kiddos, I'm noticing that out of the destabilize answers, that there were a lot of students that answered, so they chose stabilize for both the correct answer and that number one distractor. And they did not choose destabilize at the same rate. So it seems obvious to me that they understand that there is an attempt to stabilize things here, and that's a big part. Okay, so now I'm looking at the second half of the question, and I see there either negative feedback or positive feedback. And so all we're doing is just kind of switching these two things and seeing if students understand what stabilization means and whether this is an example of negative or positive feedback. And so what's really, really interesting here is that students, they answered stabilize correctly for each of these questions, or more students did that, a lot more students, 18% chose D. But it looks to me like they understand that there was stabilization, but these kiddos may have struggled with the idea that, what negative feedback and what positive feedback are. And that is a very explicit and specific thing. So we can sit down and talk to students about, here's an example of positive feedback. Here's an example of negative feedback. Is this positive or negative feedback? And we can ask that question over and over to just really drive home the fact that, like shivering is an example of negative feedback. And maybe like global warming is an example of positive feedback. And there are some mechanisms that, that respond negatively to different inputs or respond positively and will ramp up the more that there's, input into that. And so that's one of the ways that we look at the answer choices, the distractor analysis, to make sure that we're not just looking at the standards, but we're also looking at the question and the answers and saying like, why may students have struggled with this? Awesome. Cool. And with that, that's it, y'all. You're awesome. Thank you so much for being here and for talking with us and asking great questions. We're really, really excited to be able to share all of the progress and all the awesome stuff that Oklahoma City Public Schools has done within our orbit. I just want to give a shout out to Dan for popping in here and giving us so many awesome things to chew on and think about. If this was interesting to you and you want to dive into or meet with us to learn more about Inner Orbit, you can find a time to set up a pilot, or you can click on the link to our calendar as well. And we'd love to meet up with you and chat with you about Inner Orbit and walk you through the site. You can also follow us on social. So we do post stuff on social. Probably our YouTube channel is the most active of all of our different channels. So subscribe there if you want to get a little bit more information about Inner Orbit and just the NGSS in general. And if you also have questions, you're very, very welcome to send us an email at inquiries@innerorbit.com. And otherwise, Julie and I will hang out for a few minutes to answer other questions. But thank you very much for being here. We're very grateful for your participation, your questions, and for grappling with this and working to improve your practice for either the colleagues you support or the students that you support. Have a beautiful rest of your day, everyone. And thanks so much for being here.